5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Hello, everyone. All of you are welcome to the fourth evening event of White Cane and Accessibility Festival, which is online this year due to the pandemic. Hello, everyone. All of you are welcome to the fourth Okay. Today we have also a really exciting topic, and we will be discussing the social history of blindness. And at some point in our lives, most of us experienced the loneliness, the sense of loneliness, being the only disabled one, being the only blind one in the school, in the workplace, in the university, in the social environment. And for example, for me, I was the only blind person in the elementary school and high school, and it was really influential for me to start the university and have other blind colleagues with me. And it was really influential for me to discover my own disabled identity. And now, today, we are asking the same question in terms of the history. And are we alone in the history? How about our blind or disabled ancestors? How did they live? What did they do? And how was their social environment? And to talk on this, we are hosting Selina Mills with us from London. Maybe she can introduce herself before beginning a little bit. And before I have a few words to say, actually, I met her while translating a BBC documentary into Turkish, which is Disability and New History. At the last episode, she was there. And she brought us the voice of a French blind woman from 19th century. And it was really brilliant for me. Adele Husson, the French woman, and I felt like, yes, I have brilliant ancestors before me. I am process. I'm in them.
Arkadaşlar, yönetici arkadaşlar, bütün herkesi Elif ve şey dışında mute eder misiniz? Siz yapabiliyorsunuz onu. Ecem Nur. Herkesi mute et ki biz uğraşmayalım. Seslerini kapat herkesin. Tamam, devam edelim. Pardon, kusura bakma.
Hello. I think that we've got a picture of a gentleman drinking something.
Radyo yayına gitti arkadaşlar.
Şu an duyamıyoruz bir şey.
Sessizleşti.
Galiba herkes sessiz oldu.
Beni duyabiliyor musunuz? Beni duyabiliyor musunuz?
Evet, şu an duyuyoruz abi.
Elif'i duyamıyorum.
Yapınca
Elif,
herkesi mute etmiş oluyor.
Evet.
mute ol, herkesi mute etmeyecektin. Sadece ya Elif ve benim
Kişi participantların üzerine gelip Elif,
Tamam.
Selina ve kim başka?
Beni de bırak, geri kalanı mute et
üçünü.
demiştim. Ama sen bizi de mute ettin galiba.
Evet hocam,
öyle bir şey
tamamını
oldu.
et deyince sizi de
Hayır, mute all yap demedim ama seçerek, yani panelistlerden kastettim.
Tamam.
Tam açıklayamadık.
Tamam
ya. Tamam.
Elif,
Evet.
Elif, are you ready?
Radyo gitti arkadaşlar.
Radyo,
Eyvah. Tekrar mı başlasak? Kayıt da bozuldu ama.
Kayıtta bir sorun yok ya, kayıt yapıyordur.
Şu
Elif
an
nerede?
araya böyle bir şey girdi ya.
Geldi ama şu an sesim geliyor mu?
Duyuyor musunuz? Buradayım.
Tamam Elif,
Duyuyoruz.
başlar mısın? Bir sayın oldu. Arkadaşlar, Ecem Nur, yani tek tek yapman lazım onu, böyle hepimizi birden pat diye
Peki
etme.
hocam, kusura bakmayın gerçekten.
Yok, önemli değil. Elif, bir baştan başla istersen, çünkü bir karıştı ortalık. En baştan başlarsak, kusura bakmayın. Sorry, we had a problem. Selina, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Okay. Let's start from the beginning. Ecem Nur, dikkat et, tek tek. Olur mu? Hepimizi öyle pat diye etme. Okay.
Peki
I
hocam.
will start from the beginning. Okay. When you say Engin abi, you can start. I will start.
Okay, you can start. No problem.
Hello again. All of you are welcome to the fourth evening event of Accessibility and White Cane and Accessibility Festival, which is online this year due to the pandemic. And today also we have a really exciting topic. We will be talking about the history, social history of blindness. At some point in our lives, most of us experienced the sense of loneliness in the workplace, in the school, in the social environment. For example, for me, I was the only blind student in the elementary and high school. And it was really influential to discover my own identity, my disabled identity, to start to university and to have other colleagues who are also blind as me. Now we are asking the same questions for our history. Are we alone in the history? Do we where were our disabled and blind ancestors?
Elif, I'm so sorry. I apologize. Şu an interpreterler duyulmuyor. Onlara bir acil müdahale gerekir mi? Şu an duyuyoruz
Yes,
Faruk.
seni duyuyoruz.
Elif'le beraber konuşur musunuz? Lütfen konuşun. Elif'le beraber konuşun.
Yes. Where is I?
Duymuyor dediniz.
Yes. We will be discussing the social history of blindness today, as I said. Is it okay? Can you hear now?
One interpreter
Şebnem'i duyamıyoruz.
is hearing, but Şebnem is cannot. I cannot hear Şebnem.
Şebnem isn't here.
O zaman Faruk sen konuş. Bir dahaki arada
Yep.
değiş.
Seni duyuyoruz abi, tamam. Yes, you can go on, Elif.
Okay, kaldığım yerden. Okay. And now we will host Selina Mills to talk on this topic. Maybe she can introduce herself to us before beginning. And we will base our, she will base her speech on her book, Life Unseen, The Story of Blindness. Unfortunately, we have the book in Turkish. We haven't the book in Turkish yet, but we have the author with us, fortunately. And yes, I'm so happy to have you here to listen to you. And yes, we are listening to you now.
Hello, good evening from London. Would you like me to introduce myself?
Yes, is it possible?
So my name is Selina Mills. I'm a writer and journalist. I live in London, but I've lived all over the world. And I started losing my sight when I was born. I was born with no right eye. And then in my 30s, I started losing my sight even more. And I'm now legally blind. So I can see some things, but not much. And I have a training in history. I studied history at American University at Brown and then at Cambridge. And then I went on to be a journalist. So I sort of feel like I'm on both sides of active or documenting real history and also researching history. And I started writing this book, quite a few years ago, because I felt exactly what you said, which is isolation. I felt that I was on my own. So you tell me when you want me to start talking about my book. Otherwise, I will stop.
Whichever you wish. It depends on you.
Yes, no, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go.
Okay. Then.
So first of all, I have to say my best Turkish to everybody. So I have to say Bodaci Üniversitesi Sinde olmak bir onur. Is that right? If I said something awful, anyway, I'm sure I've said something awful, but anyway, that's the best as it's going to be today. Thank you so much for having me, and I can only wish I was in Istanbul. I would be there. I would get on the plane. I promise you. As you can imagine, disability is a big topic, and blindness. It covers so many areas. And when Elif called me, I'm very glad that she said, oh, just blindness, because I thought, oh my God, I can't do the whole of disability. And I need to also say, before I start, that I will be talking about blindness in a very Western way, a very Western perspective. And there is a whole other book and another history to write about blindness from a different perspective, maybe from an Eastern or African. This is definitely a very European Western viewpoint. So we will stick to that arena today. The first thing I always say is that there's no easy way to think about blindness in history, because it's integral to all of history. Whether it's legal, religious, social, sexual, political, psychological, medical, or even education, the notion of blindness, of not seeing, both is a physical state, but a metaphorical one as well. And it's usually connected to not knowing, of knowledge. And it's permeated history for millions of years. So in this short time that we have together tonight, I'm not going to give you the whole story, but I do hope I can give you a map of how we might think about it and why it's so much more than just a myth or superheroes or beggars and desperate people. It's definitely so much more. And just to give you a context of why I became interested, as you know, I'm a journalist and I've had bad eyesight. I have a false eye in my right eye. And I started losing my sight quite badly in my 30s. And it was a very strange sensation because I didn't really feel it. I didn't know, this idea that you suddenly go blind. But it's just something that happened slowly. And I began to realize it was sort of, one day I hugged a tree instead of my father, which was a bit strange. And then I realized actually, my life, I had adjusted somehow and I had changed. So I went to my eye doctor and he said, oh, look, you have a condition it's going to get worse and we can't do anything about it. So I continued my journalism, and I decided that, I'll deal with it when I deal with it. And I looked into learning Braille, and it's really hard. But actually, I've noticed it's really good in the bath because you can just lie in the bath and read Braille. I'm considering, getting a guide dog. I have a cane, and now I use specialist software for my computer. So, how did I get from just being a sort of semi-blind person to deciding to write the history book about blind people? And I actually think it started about 10 or 15 years ago when I was at university. And I was sitting in this sort of very old oak room, a library in Cambridge. And some of my professors said, how is your eyesight, Selina? And they knew I was losing my sight. And, I'm quite chatty person. I was like, oh, I'm still a journalist at the Daily Telegraph and my eyesight is getting worse, but oh well. And when we started eating, there was a lot of sort of, oh, it must be very difficult and, well done for keeping going. But this one man said, well, I was lucky to be alive in the 21st century. Because in the 19th century, he said, I would have been put into an institution or a workhouse, or if I was very lucky and rich enough, left at home. And this other medical student said, oh, yes. He said, you would not have fit the criteria of Darwin's, theory, and I would have more than likely died from an infection after another doctor tried to fix me. And then this other woman at the end of the table, who was like this very stately, very dignified woman, said, oh, I don't know. She said, if you'd been a Neanderthal, you might have been revered and treated with great honor, and you might have outlived your sighted peers, your other Neanderthals. I was like, what? And in 1961, she told us this story that in a cave in the Zagros Mountains on the border of Turkey and Iraq, a group of archaeologists discovered the burial site of male skeletons, which were 50,000 years old. And one skeleton they called Nandi. And Nandi showed severe signs of deformity, particularly around his eye sockets. And indeed, the modern methods of testing showed that his bones contained a disease which confirmed he definitely was blind. And that means he was in a state that could not allow him to hunt or gather food. And yet, this is the really interesting bit. Unlike his peers who died in their 20s, Nandi died when he was 45. And so this professor said somehow somebody fed and watered or cared for blind Nandi, for this blind Neanderthal. And we all looked at each other and were like, oh my gosh, it's so interesting. So we then moved on and we talked about other things and I went home. But when I was at home, I just loved the idea that this prehistoric figure that we have nothing on other than his skeleton had survived longer than his contemporaries. And hearing about him was like a faint wave from the past. And I found myself thinking how even the smallest bit of new information can shift your perception of the past just instantly. And Nandi's story is part of blind people's identity as much as hunting, gathering, eating, fishing, and even loving. And just knowing that blind Nandi lived and functioned with blindness 50,000 years ago gave me particularly a great sense of shared human experience. And that rather cheered me up. One thing puzzled me though. The warm, round archaeologist who told us there was no evidence to show how the other Neanderthals worked with Nandi, we don't know if he had a special burial, did he just die where he lived, in the cave, and there are no images or poetry to the cave walls. So how does the professor know or even imagine that Nandi was revered, put in the altar of the gods? How did we, as an educated bunch of people, imagine that this was the case? Because of course, Nandi could have just been a greedy man who happened to live by a berry tree or water, and he was sustained like that. Maybe he wasn't special at all. And if he was fed, maybe it was simply because everybody was eating. So why was Nandi, blind Nandi, so special simply because he was blind? And I sort of thought about this and I really wanted to write about it. And then I just got busy and I was working. And then I got this phone call about 3 months later. And this journalist rang me and she said, oh, Selina, she said, I heard that your eyesight is you're going blind. Oh, you poor thing. Could you write about it? And could you write about what it's like having sex when you're blind? And she seemed so excited that she'd come up with this idea. And all I really want, and she said, oh, I'm going to pay you really well. And I thought, well, I just didn't know what to answer. It was sort of like everybody else. And apart from the fact that I thought it was rude of her to ask this, I found myself asking what I now call the Nandi question. Why is blindness always loaded with cultural expectation? Isn't it just a physical state of not seeing? And indeed, as somebody who's losing her sight, why didn't I know I had special powers that I had, was I going to become really clever? And would I have special powers of perception and touch and hearing and smell? And would I become a superhero journo, investigating stories no one else could see? And to me, the answer seemed that's very unlikely. So I did try and write about it as a news article. And I wondered if I could do a sort of personal piece on, the presumptions of people. And while that would have been very interesting for about a day, it made me think that I should do something bigger. The first time I went and researched the history of blindness, I went to the British Library. And I looked at everything from real lives to fictional lives. And, if I could, into stories about Nandi, people who lay beneath the surface. And as we all know, blind people have been part of the general lot of humanity for millennia. And we know this because they've had congenital disease, age, war, accident, and occasionally punishment. But what's really clear is that very few blind people have made the history books. And when they do, and whether it's bad or good, blindness is always portrayed as either A, something different, it's other, it's exceptional, or awful. And being blind has always been a status, given a special status to whoever is blind. And it's far more important than just seeing. It's a specialness that's been perpetuated, propelled, and ratified even into the modern day. And a gentle walk through history shows there are blind suspects and heroes that a lot of us have heard of. So you have Homer, Oedipus, Tiresias, Didymus of Alexandria. You have Bible stories with conversions. And, you know, there are millions horrible nuns, tons of lovely nuns, Lucy, St. Odile, all the Christian ones. And there are medieval stories and Byzantine stories where people have gone to battle blind and they're heroes. And then as we get more and more documentation with the growth of newspapers and journalism, it becomes easier to find stories of blind men and women who have wisdom and knowledge and talent. So you have everyone from Sir Nicholas Sanderson, who was the great mathematician, who was in the same professor as Stephen Hawking. In Vienna, you have my favorite lady of all time, Teresa von Paradis, who, like a sort of pop star, reinvented herself every decade and went around the world and had affairs with Haydn and Salieri. And when I read about these really sort of exceptional stories, I felt happy, you know, wow, it means it's the best of what blind people can be. But on the other hand, I was really, really depressed. Because if blind people were not talented or superhuman, the alternative was people were constantly represented as tragic emblems of loss, of pity, and they were burdens on society. So worse for me as a blind woman who was neither supernatural or tragic, but just a journalist, was that blindness was very rarely talked about in a neutral, less extreme way. And I think, in fact, there was little evidence of real lived experiences simply because up until the invention of Braille in the 19th century, the majority of blind people had no access to reading, education, or speaking for themselves. And indeed, blind people were and still are constantly depicted as something extreme, different, other. And the otherness has been constantly represented in myths and legends, or as we like to call to you today, fiction. And just in case you think, oh, that's all in the past, you just need to think about my young American nephews who tell me that popular modern day legends reiterate this idea of exceptionalness. Marvel has Daredevil, who's a blind lawyer at day, but a superhero at night because he's got special senses. Neo in The Matrix is blind in the 3rd episode, so he can understand the Matrix. And even Harry Potter is blinded in the Philosopher's Stone, so he can see evil. And while I am the last human on the planet, perhaps not to have seen Game of Thrones, I am reliably informed that the character of Arya Stark, and this is, I do not know about this, please forgive me, I don't watch Game of Thrones. She's a blind character who, while is an underdog, becomes blind and sees the truth. So as you go through these documents, you begin to understand that there are many different narratives around blindness. And if I was going to do a good job on looking at the history of blindness, I have to map very many different arenas. And above all, none of these stories are one story. They're not going to fit together in this perfect, linear, seamless line. And I know the quick read culture gives us a need for logic and quick turnaround, but it's important, just in talking about blind history, that any blind story is confusing, long, and it means that we might have to wander through many different stories rather than progress straight forward. And they often go together. So tonight, while I can't give you the entire arena, I've been doing this for 10 years. What I thought I would do in the 3 years, in the next 30 minutes, is share with you 3 highlights from different eras that I have explored and what I've learned from that. So before I go on, are there any questions?
Maybe we can leave the questions to the end.
Okay, I will keep going. So my first real arena was classical literature or classical times, and why nobody can put their fingers on why blindness is, as a physical state or a metaphorical one, is considered special and unique, especially in the Western Hemisphere. It's fair to say that scholars and disability commentators have consistently pointed out that much of our exceptional thinking about blindness comes from the classical worlds of Athens and Rome. Life here was ordained by the wills of the god on Mount Olympus, and a belief system that explained the world as a preordained fate. Blindness was therefore something that happened to one because of the gods, rather than by accident. And thus to be blind gave the owner the possibility of immense life-altering power. And the first person to get this brilliant, immense power is the father of literature and the blind poet supreme, Homer. And as the playwright Aeschylus writes, all other literary works have been slices from the great banquet of Homer. And almost all biographies of Homer tell us he was blind. The general consensus is that he lived between the 8th and the 7th centuries and composed or was part of a collaborative group of poets who had a major hand in creating the Odyssey and the Iliad. And while details of Homer's life is murky, what we do know is that blind Homer was a consistent and well-marinated brand handed down from generation to generation. And so my first question is, how do we know if Homer was really blind? And why should we care if he was? What if he was simply a poet who created exquisite epics? What if he was talented or not talented, like Nandi, with a penchant for poetry? And it's a question that quite a few historians have considered. Some scholars claimed Homer was labeled blind because he and his fans knew it was a clever marketing strategy to be connected to the gods. Just being your local poet was not so unusual, and thousands of people across Europe and Asia made a living becoming wandering minstrels, musicians, and storytellers. Adding the label blind connected him as a storyteller to knowledge of an all-powerful set of gods, which means he had private access to them and he could provide a knowledge of a different kind. It made him and his work special. And others have argued that Homer was not blind at all, but in fact a bard, a poet floating in a reverie, in a dream. After all, the Odyssey was often recited from memory, which takes a lot of concentration, where one might close one's eyes. This theory was considered in the 1930s when 2 Harvard professors, Milman Parry and Albert Lord, saw and filmed Balkan singers throw themselves into rhapsodic trances in telling stories. They proved, they said, Homer's blindness was not lack of sight, but the tales of his eyes half closed were tales of a man in a trance, in a dream. And to add to this theory, other academics have suggested too Homer was not blind, but simply an old man who had bad sight, as many of us will have in our older years. And let's just go back to the marketing theory, which I actually really like. We could also consider that Homer might have relied on his fictional notion of blindness in order to promote himself. To survive economically in 300 BC as a blind man must have been very difficult. Being blind added a certain special sheen. But the good news is it's not
Bir
just...
tane parmak kalktı şu anda ama sorumuz var sanırım.
After the presentation, presentation will end, then we will get questions, okay? Go on, please, Selina. I'm so sorry.
It's okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
so the other exciting bit is it's not just in ancient Greece, nor the European gods, the northern European gods, so Scandinavia and Nordic gods also love playing with the power that sight and lack of sight imparts. Interestingly, the top Norse god, he's usually called Odin or Woden, which is where we get the word Wednesday, was also called Blindir. Isn't that interesting? And this is because, the story goes, Odin or Blindir loses part of his sight deliberately in order to gain access to sacred wisdom. So he takes out his own eye, and in order to be given permission to drink from the well of wisdom. And he drops his eye into the well, where it remains as a token of his sacrifice. And as a result, he sees more with his one eye than he ever did with two. And as with people like Tiresias, I don't know if you all know Tiresias from various Greek stories, it shows that there's a direct connection between blindness and wisdom. It's a direct transaction, and a physical eye for a spiritual one. And nobody says no one says sacrificing your eyes on the level with knowledge. But the implication is that they are things that only a blind person can have a connection with a god on earth. So by achieving blindness, Blindir gains his understanding beyond the normal world. And he throws down his sight for his people. So it's very interesting. The ancient possibilities of blindness are that it's static and it gives the owner the ability to know what happens next. And it's really interesting because other poets, modern day poets, so everyone from Dante, Tennyson, T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, they all use that metaphor, that blindness is an access to wisdom. And even the blind professor, the professor who told us about Nandi, is not alone in assuming that blind people are revered in ancient times. And I think as a race, we don't want to imagine that blind people are simply, well, blind people. And it's far easier to cope with it if you think that a blind person has achieved something in their lives. So it's not related to their talent as a person, but the fundamental belief that blindness is different and dramatic. So that's one arena that I looked at. Another very, very significant arena is perhaps one of the oldest and most obvious sources of stories, and that's creation myths, religious and sacred documents, so from around the world, and particularly the Bible. Because even before the Bible was written, or dear old Nandi, or Neanderthal, was in his cave, almost every religion has a creation myth that is fueled by light in some respects. So it's amazing how light and dark are sort of put as oppositions to each other. So the Egyptians said the sun came directly from a mound or a lotus flower that grew from the mound in form of a falcon and then became a human child. So light produced humanity. Further east, Japanese myth said that light particles rose from shapeless matter and rose up, and the sounds sank down.
Selina, excuse me. I think Şebnem, his fault is her problem. If you wish, you can change translators.
Okay.
Okay, you go on.
Do you want me to start again from the beginning of the?
No. You go on. No problem. Continue where you left off.
Okay. So I got to the Egyptians who said the sun came from the hill, and it kind of came out and produced a child. And the Japanese myths say that light particles rise from shapeless matter and rise up while sound goes down. In the Navajo in North America, the mists of light arise through darkness to animate and bring purpose to the lower worlds. And interestingly, Hindu creation myths focus on the sound first, but it has the most significant essential festival of light, Diwali, signifying victory of light over darkness, good over evil, knowledge over ignorance, and hope over despair. So key to our understanding of light, or its lack, is therefore to understand it's considered by humanity in general the genesis of everything good. Light, we presume, allows the human to find a mate, to hunt, to plant, to survive on Earth. It allows people to share knowledge, first by hieroglyphics and then printed matter and now computers, to avoid danger and find love. And then, of course, you have the Judeo-Christian creation myth, for in the beginning, as Genesis, the very first book in the Bible, says, God said, let there be light, and there was light. And the thing about the light, it was good. It therefore determined that darkness was bad. So if you think about it, light has been always connected to sight and darkness and to blindness, the opposition that comes from a need to distinguish one thing from another. Light from dark, sight from blindness, good from evil. And this is very interesting because this idea is consistently accepted, particularly in the 18th century in Europe, where philosophers insisted on the notion of the Enlightenment, where light was to throw the light of knowledge on dark, old, mythical, archaic notions of the world. And I think the change that I think is very interesting is that as you move into sort of the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, I think that what happens is that while Homer and Tiresias and Blindir gain powerful wisdom and inner vision from their side, it's also clear that blindness is a moral opposition. So it starts to explain why people think of moral blindness as bad, because there's a moral distinction. So seeing the light, for example, means knowing the truth, whether finding the Messiah or scientific reality. Light and dark are essential signposts and help guide humans through difficult times. In other words, just as Europe creaked and groaned from a world of pagan, Norse and Judaic gods to the Christian ritual, to Jesus, in many traditions, we begin to see, quote, the truth. And the biggest story and the best example of this is conversion stories, when people are converted to Christianity. So the most famous in the Bible is the conversion of Saul to Paul. And it's told 3 times in the Bible, and predominantly in the book called the Acts of the Apostles. And we're told about Saul, who is an oppressor of Christians. And he's on his way to Damascus with his Christian-hating friends. And as he walks, this light falls around him, and he falls to the ground, and he goes blind. And a voice comes down and says, "Why are you persecuting the faithful people?" And he doesn't answer, there's just this light. And Saul gets up from the ground, and when he opens his eyes, he's completely blind. So he gets taken to Damascus, and for 3 days he's blind, and he doesn't eat and he doesn't drink, and he's really upset and he's confused. But it's interesting that nobody else on this trip is blinded, okay? So nobody else sees the light and nobody else hears the voice. But everybody's aware that something dramatic has happened because he's blind. And on the 3rd day, he rises from his bed and he's baptized in the new faith of Christianity, and he regains his sight, and he becomes known as Paul, the founding father, one of the founding fathers of the church, and an evangelical apostle. And his blindness is not a punishment, but a means for him and others to witness his transformation. So blindness becomes this really useful act. It's a transformative thing. And while these oppositions are very, constantly told to us, it's dark versus light and blind versus seeing, there's one difference from antiquity, from the classics, from Homer, because for Christians, blindness was not part of the result of the gods or something static, but it was the state of being that could show the power of God and Jesus. And it works in other religions too, but today we're limited on time, so I'm not going to go into other religions, but that was one I was going to use for today. And so it's like baptism. It's considered the shift from darkness to light. And, an early convert to Christianity, Tertullian, explains that baptismal water washes away the faults of the former blindness and makes us free for eternal life. So blindness, for example, in the Bible, becomes proof that Jesus is a key indicator of somebody's spiritual health. And it's a I mean, we call it a linchpin, but Jesus, the church, all his disciples used it as a way of showing a spiritual guide. And at the same time, it's still a punishment, which is also interesting. So on the one hand, you've got change and transformation and life. And on the other hand, you've got punishment. And the thing I would say I learned most about my studies of this arena was that our concept of blindness had moved away from something that was fixed and unchangeable to something that was sacred and had the possibility of transforming an individual's life. So it becomes much more of a moving thing rather than, oh, you're blind and that's it. So there are some, the good examples of that is Jesus curing people, for example. So he goes and he cures people, and he says, as long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. So again, this repetition of light being truth. And I think some religious leaders have used light as an expression of their power. And before I leave this Christian arena, and the medieval one too, it's worth noting that we are still reliant and dominated by the construction of light and dark. And we equate blindness to darkness continually. Think about it. And please forgive me if this doesn't work in Turkish. I do think it works in most languages. Light is in everything. Light and blindness is in all of our language. We use blindness to show lack of judgment, lack of thought. We say blindly falls in love. A government negotiates blindly. And my father used to refer to my teenage years when I was grumpy. I was in the dark tunnel of adolescence, and I would be a fully grown adult who saw the light. And so one can have an unquestioning notion of blindness, which is quite negative. We have blind spots. And blindness, in Britain, the judge is blindfolded, so she doesn't judge unfairly. So I will end that section by saying, that it's not that strange that blindness has been looked in so negatively, because we've had it imprinted into us through history. And I think the final section I want to talk about, which I think has really influenced how we think about blindness, is the need to fix and cure the blindness. Throughout history, the need to give sight to the blind has derived its drive from many forces. Partly, it's a fascination for fixing, and it comes from ambition and competition. A doctor wants to cure people of things, and if you fix someone's sight, it's a very instant thing. But partly too, it's come from the study of optics, the scientific study and light and other forms of light rays. Such investigations have influenced mathematicians and physicists, and it continues to this day. But above all, the desire to fix blindness has come from our deep-seated notion that blindness as a state or caused by disease is terrifying, it's tragic, it's terrible, and we must do everything in our power to avoid it. We know, for example, and we know that we have had that feeling because we know, for example, there have been many, many doctors and physicians and scientists looking into fixing blindness. And one example is the great physician and philosopher and the anatomist of Imperial Road, Galen, or I think his name was Claudius Galenius. And he was one of the first, if not the first, scientists to investigate, to cut up eyes and look at them and see how to analyze them. And the eye, he said, was like a person wearing many tunicae, and working inwards, he looked at the eyeball and the retina and the iris and the cones in the back of the eye. And why would he do that? Other than to be curious, he also was obviously thinking about how it could be fixed as well. I mean, I can't speak for him, but I wonder why you would be doing that unless you wanted to see how it works. And we also know from some papyrus, Egyptian papyrus, that there were attempts to cure eye diseases in the Greco-Roman empires from squeezing the blood of pigeons, on kidneys of pigeons over people with blindness at night to offer sacrifices to various goddesses. And we don't know if they worked or not, but it is true funnily enough, that it had vitamin K in it, and so sometimes might have worked. So there's a huge legacy of thinking about the eye, fixing the eye. And we also know that there was a huge need in the 18th century, and also before, to look at how vision worked and therefore fix it when it didn't work. And this was widely investigated by scholars in India and the Middle East, and particularly in the 8th century in Baghdad, with the growth and knowledge about the world and animals that lived in it. And particularly, who's my hero, is Al-Kindi, who was the son of the royal house of Kindar and was labeled the philosopher of the Arabs. And he grew up in Basra, and then he moved to Baghdad, and he was known for his talents in logic, geometry, and mathematics, astrology. I mean, he was doing everything. But why he was not overtly fixing and curing, as far as we know, we do know that his investigations into optics laid the groundwork for Western science and medical practice for years to come. His optical work argued was about how visual rays worked and why the eye behaved in the manner that it did, including how light bounces off every surface it touches. And therefore, if you don't have the ability to have the bouncing, then you don't see. And he was greatly admired by Leonardo da Vinci, who tried to visualize his vision of light in drawings. And indeed, by the 17th century, and standing on the shoulders... Hello?
Okay, you can continue, I think.
By the 17th century, and standing on the shoulders of Al-Kindi, thinkers in Europe, such as Snedlus and Descartes, formulated the law of refraction of light. And then you have Huygens, who looks at how light travels in waves. And by the 1600s, you have Isaac Newton proving in Cambridge that light contained colors. And it was not really, though, until the 18th century that the desire by doctors and surgeons to clear the world of blindness, and they actually said that, became an obsession along the major shift in the Enlightenment. And a lot of this came from Immanuel Kant in 1784, who said to be enlightened was a way of life where it was one's right and duty to be critical in thought and examine the beliefs and premises of the world. But he also said people should dare to know, sapere aude. And while not everyone could agree on what that would be, the mantra was taken up as on the masthead of people as a flag. And it was an 18th century thinkers such as Jefferson, Voltaire, Diderot, who absolutely bought into this. And therefore, the looking at blindness was part of Enlightenment drive. If we can cure blindness, we show that we are reasonable, thinking people. So unlike the medieval view, and one could say almost the Christian charitable view of the blind person, and where Jesus would cure people, suddenly now in the 18th century, there's this surge of doctors curing blind people, and there's cataract operations. So the age of reason and curiosity, where the natural world, including man, was systematically categorized, it was full of blind stories. And I don't know if you've seen these, but in all the newspapers, there are these miracle stories of blind people being cured. And perhaps the most famous one, and it's sort of one I've got a little bit more to go, but not too much, was by this doctor called William Cheselden in 1722. And he was known for cutting out kidney stones. And he was fascinated by the debate in the philosophy houses, which was John Locke and William Molyneux, who were talking about blindness. What would happen if a man who was born blind then had his sight given back to him because of an operation? And Cheselden, this Dr. Cheselden, knew that there had been this art of, it's called couching, Couchin, in India, where you sucked out cataracts. And he decided he would have a go in London. And he knew too that there were other doctors who tried it. There was Jacques Deval in Paris, and who else was there? Monsieur Petit as well, John Freck in Ireland and in England. And everyone had tried to do this. And then for the first time in history, which was documented, let's say, this operation showed that blind people were no longer outsiders who could be feared and to be worried about and must be converted and saved. but instead they were medical objects, people who were the object of scientific and philosophical interest that could show man's abilities to overcome his physical impairment. So away from the gods of Mount Olympus, you know, and the sun and Christianity and Judaism, where people were curing the blind morally and physically, now you had one man in a chamber, smelling of blood, not good, curing people of blindness. And the thing that's interesting about this, because I don't want to go on about the medical too much, but it's really, it had two impacts on how people perceive blind people. It was one, there was publicity everywhere. And so the middle class and the upper class and the aristocrats all knew about this and they talked about it. But the second thing was that it was no longer the God's fault or a punishment or something you had to pray for, but it was now the responsibility of the blind person to fix themselves. So I think what it did, the 18th century and the Enlightenment made people think of blindness as something that, because it could be fixed possibly, it was your problem. You had to deal with it. So it's individual. It moves from the gods to God and now to the individual. So now that people are victims of a condition rather than just sinners or special people, they're actually individuals. So you can see in these three arenas, you have classical, medieval, enlightenment that I've just talked about. Blindness as an idea went from mythical inspiration, moral power, and then the object of medical inspiration. And the notion of blindness was used by each era in different ways to express what that culture and that society was most interested in. So blind people themselves had very little to say about this, which is, of course, really frustrating. So I thought I would end this talk, and it's lovely that whoever introduced me, I'm sorry I couldn't see who it was, talked about this lady. I wanted to end the talk by sharing one more story and a bit of history that I think shows how important looking at blind history is as a subject. And I think it turns out that blind people have more of a voice and much more than we realize, and might make us rethink our views about people, including Nandi and how we look at the Neanderthal Nandi. And the story goes like this. In 2001, in different parts of the world, two historians, Kathy Kudlick and Zina Wegan, published a book announcing the discovery, a new discovery. And they discovered, while researching in the archives of the 1520 Center for the Treatment of Eye Disorders and Disease in Paris, a medium-sized notebook, and it was 8 by 6 centimeters, which contained 83 handwritten pages, and it was untouched. And the notes, it was called, the note said on the front, Reflections on the Physical and Moral Condition of the Blind by Mademoiselle Adèle Husson, blind woman of Nancy. And it was composed in a series of chapters, and it was dictated by a blind woman in post-revolutionary France. And the discovery was so revealing. Not only did they were called Réflexions, is the shorthand, confirmed that educational establishments for the blind were up and running, and really ratifying the dreams articulated by Diderot in the 17th century, and even other people. But they showed how blind candidates, however poor or prosperous, had now begun to want identity and sanctuary in an establishment modeled for them, by them. And the reflections of Thérèse Adèle Husson expressed, not only as some had done before her, personal viewpoints of a young blind woman in time of Europe, but also that blindness itself was being re-examined and reconfigured. Oh, please don't yawn. There's only a little bit more to go. Even more interestingly, we learned about her. And she was born in 1803 to a middle-class family. And she shared, from Nancy, and she showed that she was a woman who had a very big vocabulary and ideas, and she knew about persuasion and rhetoric. And she was very good at showing her daily life and thoughts. Indeed, she had opinions on every topic, including marriage. And she said blind people should not marry because even though she marries, she dresses, if you can, luxuriously. And she mulls over how blind women are just as vain as sighted women. And this book, these notes were never published in her lifetime. They were a private manifesto asking for a place at an oversubscribed institute. And they did not address a public audience, nor did they offer a very well thought out political message. But they addressed, albeit inconsistently and quite with strength, an identity of blind people in 19th century. And she said, she even describes how she walks, she talks about how she eats, and she even expresses the debates of the thinkers of the time, saying, no, people have the wrong idea. And I want to read you almost just one of my favorite quotes. And I think it does say a lot about her. So she said, and I've had this is translated, "One looks upon the use of sight as one of the greatest fortunes. I cannot share this opinion. I was deprived of my sight at the age of 9 months, and I have just reached my 22nd year, and I still don't remember having one regret concerning the loss of my sight. If anything, it's the sad exclamations of people around me who do that." And while the education of, and what I find amazing about this is that while the education of every blind person would not be addressed really until the 20th century and onwards, Adele Usson showed that blind people had their own minds, their own voices, and there were real questions concerning how she should be treated, and that this was something that was a reality. It wasn't a myth, and it wasn't extreme. It was just a real life. So I want to conclude by saying, while it is true that the improvement of a blind person's life has become so much better, certainly since Homer, and Nandi even. I think it is still true that opinions around blindness still are negative. It's getting better, but one of the things I really felt about history was that it showed me how people got these ideas in the first place. And it's really not people's fault in a way if the sighted people think blindness is bad or good or stupid, whatever it is. It's not their fault. It's been told to them through history. And, while the 19th century drew to a close and blindness and other disabilities started to draw attention to how they were treated, it's very difficult for blind people to have a new, strong collective identity. I also want to say that it's very easy to sort of look at history as a natural progression from A to B, and it's all got better, and it's almost so much easier to be blind. Well, it is true in some ways. I wonder, with medical advances and the invention of Braille and modern technology, there are still signs that society is keen to, I would say, release itself from the burden of dealing with disability and blindness. And while previous eras have certainly segregated blind people by putting them as a group of beggars or burdens or medical objects, we still, as a sighted society, label blind people with pity. And we use words like unfortunate, suffer from blindness, or living in the dark. And that it always says that it's a lack and it needs fixing. And moreover, the blindness is still considered a state where the blind person is responsible for their treatment, but also their role in society. And that responsibility is very heavy, and it's only occasionally taken away by innovation and compassionate, thoughtful people. So, of course, I'd like to say, I am glad I'm a blind person in the 21st century. Probably much easier. And it is true that we have far more options now to sustain ourselves than we ever did before. I can work, I can read, I can get around, I have a husband. And I certainly don't think all of those things would have been possible had I been born in the 19th century. But I would also say that we are also only just beginning to find our voice. And whether this is from school, education, or working, or even writing history books and giving lectures in Istanbul. It is true that we need to have a say in our own lives, and that we should have the opportunity, as I do now this evening, which I thank you for. And I think it's more than important than ever to share our knowledge and our views. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I should say that it's really great to meet all those people, and it's a really influential data that you collect, and what you do is a really great work, I think. And I can see the effort that you spend, and it's really great, and really thank you again. Now we can have the questions maybe. Ecem Nur, can you help us with this?
Tabii ki. Şu anda bir parmak var, Çağrı Artan.
Hı hı.
Kendini unmute edebilir.
Benim sanırım anonsum arkadan gelen, doğru mudur?
Duyamadık onu. Yani çok küçük bir anonstu, çok duyamadık onu.
Evet, Çağrı, evet. Doğru Çağrı. Sen konuşacaksın.
Okay. Şey için teşekkür ediyorum. Çok ufuk açıcı bir söyleşi. Her ne kadar arkada sosyal medya tarafını koordine ederken de kaçırsam da çok teşekkür ediyorum katılım için öncelikle Selina'ya. Sadece bu noktada hani birçok tespitini aktardı tarihten bugüne. Körlüğün, daha doğrusu görmenin hegemonyasının dünya üzerinde çok üst düzey olduğu bir...
Böyle yapalım mı? Çünkü çok uzun olunca ben de kaçıracağım çevirirken.
Nasıl yapalım?
Başlayayım şimdiye kadar kısmını çevirmeye.
Peki.
Yardım ederim ben sana. Bitirsin o. Öyle olur.
Tamam. Peki öyle
Ben
yapalım.
sonuna geliyordum. Sadece şunu soracağım. Bu kadar büyük bir tarihsel baskı var üzerimizde. Her ne kadar belli şeylerde adımlar atılmış olsa da kendisi özellikle sonradan görme kaybı yaşayan ve aynı zamanda bu tespitleri yapan biri olarak mental bakımdan zorlandığı anlar oluyor mu? Bu kadar şey onu baskı altında bırakıyor mu? Bırakıyorsa çözüm için ne tür anahtarları var elinde? Teşekkürler tekrardan.
Okay, I will translate him. He is really thankful to you and what you talked about, even though he was busy with these social media things. He was really inspired by what you say, and he would like to ask whether if you have yes, there's this great dominance of seeing and sight
Yes.
historically on us, and he is asking whether if you have some points, some if you have some mentally if you have difficulties and about what you find and how you cope with these findings and what you meet and how would it work?
I don't really are you asking me about my research? How is it difficult for me to research?
Yes, specifically your special moments that you are you felt somehow suppressed and oppressed and maybe depressed.
At least once a week, at least. I think it's the ignorance of people. So I in my own home, I'm fine. I know my home. My husband knows that I'm, blind, so he helps me. But we have an agreement. In English, you say consent. I consent for him to help me. I think what I find hard in the outside world is that people are so generous in the sense that they want to help you, but they don't ask you for your advice. Like they don't go, "Can I help you?" They just take you across the road. Or I think that's changing, but I still find it very difficult to. I think people presume a lot about blindness. I'm very lucky. I work for a charity that is with disabled people, and so we all have something in my office, like it's like it's like a big room full of disabled people. And so I think I'm lucky in that I have a world that I can feel comfortable and myself in. But the bigger world, the outer world, it's really hard. And it's everything from I want to, the fact that I have to ask to take someone to take me to the toilet. I hate that. I hate the fact that I need to say, please, can you show me where the bathroom is? I hate that. I hate not reading. So I'm very grateful that I can read still. But I hate it when I need other people's voices to read, because I need to hear the words in my head. I don't want to hear how other people translate. But I'm sort of at peace with it now. It took a long time, but I'm at peace with the fact that I don't see now, because I have so many other things in my life. So it's not the only thing that defines me, my blindness.
Thank you.
Bir parmak daha var. Meral Sözen.
Merhaba. Benim sorum biraz kişisel de olabilir ama kişisel bir örnek aklına gelmezse daha güncelden bir örnekle de cevabımı alabilirim. Şu ana kadar özetlediği tarihte özellikle vurguladığı bir şey vardı. O da şu: körlerin işte negatif veya pozitif anlamda abartıldığı konusu. Yani trajedileştirilen veya kahramanlaştırılan kör öyküleri. Bunların hepsi çok çok ilginçti, çok güzeldi. Şöyle bir şey sormak istiyorum. Şimdi tam bugün de kendi yaşamından bir örnek eğer varsa, günümüzde bunların uzantısı, benzeri ve hatta aynısı diyebileceğimiz örneklerle karşılaşıyor mu? Daha bugünden, yani bugüne dair yapılan bir şey ama tarihtekinin de birebir yansıması olabilecek. Bize bunlardan örnek verebilir mi, bahsedebilir mi?
She asks, during your speech, you talked about the blindness as an extreme experience.
For some people, yeah.
Yes. She's asking whether if you have a similar experiences or similar situations that you can give example as examples from today, and it might be your personal experiences or might be recent.
Well, I think for me, I was talking about how blindness is depicted in films now. So you have, that's a really obvious way of seeing it. So you have The Matrix, Harry Potter, Game of Thrones, and blindness is always this extreme gift, so you can see the truth. I do get a lot of, but personally, on a personal level, I get a lot of people who presume I've got a very good memory and that I can hear really well. So people always go, oh, well, you're blind, so you can really hear well. And I'm like, well, yes. So it's interesting that it's, again, back to people's presumptions. Adele, who saw in the 19th century, had it right. It's how others see that. So they think it's extreme, but we all know, if you're blind, that it's just living your life.
Thank you again. And
Translation'larımız değişsin isterseniz arkadaşlar. Faruk bir ara gitti ama geldiysen alabilirsin.
Bir sorumuz daha var bu arada. Gizem Dağ.
Kendinizi unmute edebilirsiniz.
Mikrofonumu açtım. Şimdi geliyor mu sesim?
Şu an.
Merhaba. Şimdi benim sorum şöyle. Bir şeyi değiştirmek için önce onunla ilgili doğru tespitlere ulaşmak gerek ve sizin tespitlerinizin özellikle bu yüceltme ve trajedi olarak görme ile ilgili şeylerin bugün de birebir olduğuna çok inanıyorum ve bunun tarihten gelen yanıyla ilgili bir bilgim yoktu. Böyle bir düşüncem yoktu. Nereden geliyor acaba diye sorup duruyordum kendime. Cevabını aldım. Ve iki sorum var size. Birincisi, bu tespitlerinizin yanı sıra tespit ettiğiniz bu durumların değişimi için nelerin gerekli olduğuna inanıyorsunuz? İkinci soruda eşinizin size yardım ettiğini ama sizin bu yardımı istediğiniz için problem olmadığını, dışarıdaki insanların daha çok yardım ettiğini bu şekilde anlattınız. Buradan yola çıkarak ben de kendi aile ilişkilerimle ilgili annemin bana zorla yardım etmediğini biliyorum mesela. Ama bazı noktalarda ya da ailemin, gören arkadaşlarımın çok net bilsem de beni anlamaya çalıştıklarını, bana dışarıdaki insanlardan daha yakın olduklarını, daha aynı noktada olduklarını bilsem de tam olarak yine de bazı yerde kör olmasına rağmen şunu yaptı ya da kör ve bir başkası hakkında konuşurken ya kör gözüyle bu hatayı yaptı, nasıl görmedi gibi söylemlerine rastlıyorum ve ben şunu çok üzülüyorum. Kendi ailemi değiştiremediysem çevremi nasıl değiştirebilirim? Siz gerçekten eşinizin bu konuda sizi net anladığına inanıyor musunuz?
Ya da böyle bir ilişki mümkün mü?
Yani böyle bir ilişki mümkün mü? Nasıl değiştirilebilir? Yani yardım ediyor diyorsunuz ama eşim yapıyor diyorsunuz ama %100 müdür bu anlayış? %100 müdür bu aynı pencereden bakabilme? Değilse bile en azından kendi çekirdek küçük çevremizi bu noktaya getirmenin yöntemi ne olabilir? Belki koca bir dünyayı değiştiremeyiz ama küçük çevremizi getirmenin yöntemi ne olabilir?
Okay. I'll try to summarize because I'm not a translator and I'm not that good. And she's also thankful to you and really inspired about the historical basis. And also we had the similar issues today and she is really inspired of having this historical background. She has two questions to you. At first, about the depiction of the blindness and dramatizing the blindness, etc. What would you suggest to change such depictions? What channels do we have and what can we do? And another second question, maybe I can leave or continue.
Maybe I do the first one first.
Okay.
So the answer is you have to give people a voice. You have to let the people whoever they are, whether it's blind or any minority that is spoken about, they have to tell the story. So the more people that we can find in history or in the present day to talk for ourselves, the better. And that's why I think I could not have written this book in my 20s or my 30s, because I don't think I understood what it was to lose my sight. And I'm not saying that anyone can't write about this or film it, but I think we have to be really careful about how the story is told. And if you do it from the point of view of sighted people, whatever going to happen, you're always going to do it from somebody who thinks that sight is really, really more important than anything else. Whereas if you're blind, you see the world. There's a really good professor you should look up called Hannah Thompson, Professor Hannah Thompson at London University. And she calls it blind positive. This is what are the things that blindness can offer us that actually help the sighted world. So you turn it over on its head. It's not just that sight is at the top and blindness is at the bottom. It's equal. And so the answer to your question is, in order to make things better, I think you need to get more blind voices in the mainstream, basically.
And the second question was about a kind of personal experience. You talked about your relation with your husband and how you are more comfortable with him other than this people outside. And she was asking, coming from her own personal experiences, even though she have some closer friends or family and they are better with their relations and how to cope with blindness, etc. But she feels like still there is a gap. And is it really possible to connect 100% with blind?
No, I think it's actually not a blind question. I would actually turn around and say, is it possible for any human, blind or not, to connect completely with another human? And I think I suspect it's going to be difficult every time because it's hard to know how other people think and how they feel. I do think language has a lot to do with this. So if we were in a world where it was quite normal to be blind, it's not exceptional, it's not special, it's not weird, it's not difficult. If it was just easy, then I think the language we use around blindness would be less, in English you say loaded, so it would be less provocative.
Mhm.
So I don't think, I would not like to go down the road of that, blind people, otherwise you go into the blind people are special category, and I don't want to be the blind people are special. I just want to be me. So and my husband is a philosopher, and he I think he just would say people are people. So whether you're blind or deaf or whatever, it's really a question of who and how you connect with the other person. And if I've been with my husband for 13 years, so obviously we know each other really well, so that's why it's easy. But maybe with somebody who's a stranger, it's really hard because you can't explain everything quickly. So for me, again, it's sort of in referral to her first question, it's really a question about changing how society sees blindness, because that will make it less it will make it less of a burden for everyone. Because if we all think of it as normal and we all think of it as part of society, and I actually believe this of all disability, then it doesn't become an issue. It's just, oh, we're all in this together.
Thank you. Another question?
2 tane daha var. Öncelikle Habil Bozkurt.
Sesim geliyor mu? Önce onu kusura bakmayın.
Evet, duyuyoruz.
Tamam, duyuyorsanız. Şey soracağım ben. Homeros'un şiirler okuduğunu söyledik. Körlerin müziğe yönlendirildiği bilinen bir gerçek. Yine mesela diyelim bizim işte İslam dininde hafızlık çalıştırılır. Diyelim ki başka dinlerde o dinin kitabı ezberletilir. Burada soracağım husus şu. Yani bu yönlendirmelerde biraz da şu yok mu? Yani körlük, hani kör adam hani normal şartlarda bir işe yaramaz. Ama biz ona böyle bir vasıf vererek, bir paye vererek, yani işte müzisyen, işte şair, işte hafız gibi yetiştirerek onu bir nevi toplum içinde absorbe etmek şeklinde düşünebilir miyiz bunu? Yani bu tür çalışmaları, bu tür eylemleri. Yani normalde, çünkü hani Cemil Meriç'in de öyle bir sözü var. Yani diyor normalde diyor kör diyor edebiyattan da tarihten de uzaktır diyor. Toplum içine çıkmak için bir Homer, işte Mari olması gerekir diyor. Yani bu bilinçli bir tercih mi sizce? Yani körlerin böyle şeylere yönlendirilmesi. Yani onlara değersizler toplum gözünde. Hani işte müzisyen yaparak, şair yaparak, hafız yaparak değerli hale getirmek mi acaba bunun sebebi?
Umarım çevirebilirim ya. Şimdi başlayalım. Actually, you talked about Homer and his poems from antique Greece, and also in in different religions, there is this tendency that, for example, in Islam, blinds are memorizing the Quran, and they are told to be as Hafiz, the guy who knows the whole Quran. And also there is this tendency that blind people are lead to the poems, as to the literature or music, and a sort of making those people to include in the society. Can it be kind of a yes? Can it be say like this? Can it say it like this?
I don't really understand the question.
Yeah, exactly. Can it be a way of observing the people in the society?
I'm not sure if I understand. What can be a way of
Biraz daha
İsterseniz
sorun.
tekrar sorayım olmazsa anlamıyorsun.
Yani
If you like, I
somut
can,
bir soru, somut bir
I
soru.
try to
Evet.
translate it. Okay. Selina, can you hear me?
Yes.
I try to translate. We are sorry. Actually, he's asking that in history or today, blind are seen as, for example, only musicians, only they are reading some poems.
Yeah, they're put in a category. Yeah.
Yeah, there are some categories and certain categories. And the question is about, it is about the giving a little bit, they feel great, they feel better. Is it about the evaluation? Is it about the value he's asking? I mean, is it the way to observe the society from the society while giving this kind of jobs? I mean, while giving this kind of maybe definitions or some different names or different things.
Is the gentleman asking if it's a good thing that people are put in categories, or?
No, it's good. It's not. It's negative one. He's asking negative. They feel that the blinds are categorized as only musicians, as only poems, as only, I mean, as only in Islam, for example, Hafiz, in Christianity, they are only memorize the book. And
Aslında olumsuz değil, şey olarak sordum.
he's asking that,
Yani böyle bir olgu olarak sordum aslında.
is it the way to feel blind? Yes, you are also important. You are invaluable. Yeah.
Maybe we can say that it's the way of society to deal with a certain problem. The categories might be read like
Well, I
this.
think it's true. No, but it's true of every minority that it's easier to categorize, and that is very much an enlightenment. That was from the Enlightenment, where
Yes.
you would learn to put things in their little sections. Whether it's a useful thing, it's never been in my mind useful, because it's about identity, and nobody likes being put, if you're black or a Muslim, you don't like to be put in just your little corner and you go over there and you go over there. But that's, I think, possibly a political view from my point, which is I believe we're all on the planet together. So it's not necessarily helpful to start saying that blind people can only be musicians or, I think there's a big thing in China that blind people have to train to be massage therapists.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's helpful. I think that's the question is, what gives people the most freedom and the most choice and gives them the chance to be themselves. And I think history, the reason it's really good to look at history is it allows you to break up the molds, the fixed identity. It allows you to pull that apart. And it turns out that nobody we don't even know if Homer was blind. We just don't know. So even if he was, does it matter? Does it really matter? Surely it's more interesting that he was a really good poet. So it's I think categories don't, for me personally, they don't help.
Okay,
thank
you.
But I think history is about looking at how humans do that.
And thank you again. Maybe we can take the last question because we are really overdue the time. And
okay.
Bir soru vardı az önce söylediğim. Elif Ünver Çırpan.
Merhaba, hoş geldiniz. Benim sorum daha teknik bir soruyla ilgili. Bizim aslında sizin demeye çalıştığınız şey bizim çizgimizle çok benzer. Biz de Engelsiz Erişim Derneği olarak şey diyoruz, işte körlük bir eksiklik değil, bir durumdur. Özelliklerimizden bir tanesidir. Siz de sanırım zaten en başından beri bunu söylüyorsunuz. Benim sorum daha teknik bir şey. Böyle olmasından çok memnun olduğum için tekrarlama gereği duydum. Tarih deyince, araştırmacı tarih deyince aklıma hep arşivler, kağıtlar, farklı karakterlerde yazılmış yazılar geliyor. Ama bunlar da ekran okuyucularla okunabilir, taranabilir şeyler olmayabilir. Zaten işte arşivde nasıl davranacağımız meselesi, o kağıtlara nasıl hassas olabilir, daha doğrusu çok uzatmayayım. Bir erişilebilir yönteminiz var mı? Ya da bu şeyler, arşivlerin ne kadarı elektronik ortama aktarılmış durumda? Sizin daha farklı bir şey yapmanız gerekiyor mu? Ben bunu merak ettim.
Nice question. She's really thankful again and really happy to see that you are what you say is really similar to the what barrier-free access Association for Barrier-Free Access is really similar, and we are happy to see this again. And she has a technical question actually. She's asking, how do you deal with the archives? And you know that, for example, handwriting is not going well with these screen reader programs. Also, the materials that you find in the archives are really sensitive. And what would you say about the archive research? And
it's a really good question. Very good question.
Yes.
There's two options. One is I take photographs of everything on my iPhone. I get someone to take photographs, and then I can enlarge it on my phone. I also have an assistant who I get, I think, something like 6 hours a week. So when there's something really difficult, I ask them to help me. But mostly, I mean, to be honest with you, there's so little actually in the archives about that. I mean, I found 3 people who I'd never heard of before in archives. And it turns out they're kind of famous in the sense of, you know, Adele Husson and people like that. And Braille doesn't really come in until 1862. So most documents that come out in the 19th century are printed. And so you can use, there are quite a few apps that help you translate. There's also this app, which I call, by Microsoft, which somebody can read for you. So I can call it. I can call it from far away, you know, like it's called IC, you know.
What is the name of program, Selina?
I have to look it up, but I think it's called IC. Capital I, and it's like anyone in the world. It contacts you to anybody in the world in the middle of the night if you want, and you can ask.
Can you say seeing AI?
Yeah, that's it. There we go, seeing AI, and I use
Be
that.
My Eyes. Can you also say maybe say Be My Eyes?
Yes, there's Be My Eyes. I don't like that one as much. I prefer Seeing AI more. So because I also, I mean, sometimes I've met some crazy people out there, you know, so I'm quite careful, but I'm also very organized. So I have very careful filing. I know where to find things. I also have a really good library. The British Library is amazing. So they help me a lot, the team at the British Library. And sometimes they will photocopy things for me and then I can get someone else to read it. Or sometimes they'll read it to me. But there's very little by blind people until about 1850, 1860.
Can I ask something? A question from me?
Yeah.
Did you have any Braille materials that you used from archives, etc.?
There are some, but again, 1860. So Braille's invented in 1828, but it doesn't become an international language, and that because there were 5 other different systems. There was Braille, there was Moon, there was about 5 systems, and then Braille 1 became the top. It was like the difference between a video and a DVD, and then the DVD 1. So technology really didn't go for blind people until 1862. So there are stuff out there, and there's all the records. What's really interesting is the institutional records. So it's not by blind people, it's by sighted people about blind people. But that's been going since, you know, did you know there was a blind school in the Cappadocian Mountains?
Really?
You know, yeah, and then the monks would write down, you know, a blind man came to us today. and we fed him and gave him water, and then we sang with him. So we can find that you can find evidence in really interesting places, but the thing you will not find, and it's difficult, is finding the actual voice of a blind person. That's really hard.
Yes.
Yani
Elif,
I was exactly asking for this.
Elif'ciğim bizim de sorularımız var. Benim ve Engin'in soruları var. Eğer izin verirsen sormak isteriz.
Sorayım mı ben? Var mı başka soru? Varsa onlar sorsun, bir soru sorarız. Soru kaldı mı?
Sanırım chatten de sorularımız var. Bir tane de parmak var. Eğer onlar da cevaplanabilirse.
Bence onları tamamlayalım. En son Engin'le ben sorarız.
Sorun değil, bir soru.
Tamam. Katılımcılarımızdan Ahmet Talat Saygaç var. Ben ona şu anda konuşması için izin veriyorum. Şu anda izin verdim. Konuşabilir.
Sesimi duyuyorsunuz sanırım. Çok teşekkür ederim. Selina, güzel bir konuşmaydı. Chat yani sohbet bölümüne bizim bir kitabımızın linkini verdim. Bu kitap Gökyüzünü Tanıyalım konusunda ve merak ettim gerçekten gökyüzünü hiç görmeyenler ya da sonradan görme yetisini kaybedenler acaba nasıl algılayacaklar? Bunun için de sesli olarak kitabı okudum Türkçe. Bu yaptığım şey yeterince görme engelli kişiye ulaştığımı Türkiye'de bilmiyorum. Ama özellikle size sormak istiyorum. Böyle bir kitabı dinleyen görme engelli kişi gerçekten bunu içselleştirebilir mi ve bana da bir dönüş yapabilir mi acaba? Çok teşekkür ederim. Hayırlı akşamlar.
Kitap Türkçe galiba değil mi?
Kitap Türkçe.
Yani
Biz mi
belki
yapıyoruz acaba şeyden Selina'dan önce bilmedim.
Bir görme engelli olarak Selina'nın düşüncesini öğrenmek istiyorum. Kitabın elbette dosyalarını indiremez, Türkçe anlayamayacağı için. Ama bir görme engelli Türk olan, Türkçe bilen bir görme engelli buna nasıl bir tepki verecek? Şu ana kadar kendilerine bir türlü ulaşamadım tabii. Yani bilemiyorum bu kitabı indirdiler mi, indiremediler mi?
Burada hepimiz görme engelliyiz bu arada.
Öyle mi? Tamam. Adresi vermiş oldum. O zaman öncelikle sizlerden bekleyeceğim. Çok teşekkür ederim. Çok karışık bir şey oldu ama sağ olun.
Selin Hanım'a yani yine de iletelim mi sorunuzu yoksa çünkü biz daha sonra o 7. biz mi yanıtlayalım? Hani o yüzden sordum.
Onun da fikirlerini öğrenmek istiyorum. Çünkü okuma konusunda bazı şikayetleri vardı o yüzden.
Tamam. Okay.
So, do I need to understand a question?
Okay. Yeah. Söyle. Elif soruyor musun?
Okay. Actually, he talked about a audio description that he voiced, a book about the sky, and how would it be to experience a audio book about the sky as a blind, he asked. And if you wish to talk about on this, you can, of course. But the book is in Turkish, and maybe...
Wonderful. First of all, how wonderful, and why I love audio description is the best thing. I write about audio description a lot for the newspapers in Britain. I can send you an article I wrote about it and how I think it's very important for sighted people as much as blind people. So again, I think it's something, I think most people in the blind community have read John Hull, called as Touching the Rock. And he talks about poetry, all the things that you would presume that a blind person doesn't want to or know about, like color or the air. He writes about it. And I think that we should, as blind people, take courage and we should own the right to do anything we like write about. We don't have to ask permission. And writing about the sky, it's beautiful. How wonderful.
Bu sonra biz ayetten bize bir şeyler cevap
Bir
vereceğiz.
konuşalım. Ahmet Bey siz kalın. Sohbetten sonra olur mu? Gitmeyin.
Biz de bir şeyler söyleriz size. Evet, başka bir soru daha vardı galiba.
Guys, I've got time for one more question and then I have to go.
Okay.
Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
I wonder that, the England, the Britain is the land where the social model is born in 1970s. You know, UPS and
Yeah,
other
yeah, yeah.
movement, many things are. I love disability and society. Maybe you know, we read many journals, but I saw that in those areas there are very few blind academicians, researchers. Mostly the people with quadriplegia or wheelchair users are very dominated.
Oh
by
no! I can send you. I can send you a list. There's a lot of people out there. There's David Bolt. There's David Bolt. There's Liverpool University. Liverpool Hope University has a really good department. There's Professor Hannah Thompson, who's amazing. There's a team in Leeds. Leeds is the leading sort of theoretical group. You know who's missing is Oxford and Cambridge, and I think they should hire me.
If there is, so but as far as I heard, mostly why I said in 1970s or 80s blind people are very active in the streets and demonstration, other things, but why are there few in academic area? My question.
Well, I mean, you'd have to ask academics, but I would say two things. One is academia in Britain, possibly like Turkey, is very slow. We are very slow in giving new positions. We've also got very little money. So there's that normal problem, which everybody has. And then I would say blindness is really a question of whether you don't necessarily want to be a professor of disability. You might want to be a physics professor or a music professor. And I think we're still a bit behind. America far more. I mean, I don't know if you've all read Georgina Klieg. I would highly recommend Georgina Klieg. She is a wonderful writer. She's a professor at Berkeley. And she writes beautifully about everything from English literature to blindness to music to art. She writes about how blind people and art go together and her argument is brilliant, which is actually art doesn't really exist as much as you talk about it. So you can see it, but then you have to give a story to the daffodils or the Van Gogh or whatever. So that we need language. So languages, anyway, so she would be somebody I'd look at. I would say there's an increasing group in America. It's slowly building up in Britain. It's not there yet, but it's getting there. Certainly more in my own, since I started writing this book, it's become, there are more people, more blind professors and academics. But I do agree with you. I think it's difficult. And I also think it's difficult because you need help. You need support. You need someone to, we need people out there who can have something to look up to. But it's happening. It is happening.
Yeah, very good.
Again.
May I ask a question, Elif? Selina?
As last one, yes.
Okay, as last one. Okay. Selina, I realized that in the history there is a contradiction. Why I am thinking like that? For example, blinds are seen as beggars and also seen as fortune tellers.
Yeah, no, of course. It's really, I love that, but it's the extreme. What I mean by extreme and special. You're either extreme one end or you're extreme the other end.
Yes, yeah. But you said dark and you talked about dark and light and positive and negative perception of dark and light. But I understood that in this issue, dark shows realities or future expectations of the people. There is a contradiction, I think.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. But I blame sighted people all the time. The sighted people are very annoying. But I think that's true of history in general. I mean, again, I think if you look at history, this particular type of history, as I said, society uses whatever its cultural trend is or cultural need for its own purpose. So if you want to use blindness as a way of transforming people to show that your religion is better than somebody else's religion, then you'll use it. And even if it's a contradiction, I mean, because the irony is, and I didn't have time to go in this, there are lots of amazing religious writers who talk about there's lots of people who are writing about how I think it's St. Ambrose or what's the other one? Really, St. Augustine, and this. They all write about how in darkness you can find truth and light. So they themselves didn't even believe it, but they use the polarization for themselves, for whatever religion or whatever morals you want to teach. But it's sort of like now, I mean, you know, we're in the social model of disability, and you would think, here we are 100 years after Helen Keller, 200 years after Helen Keller, and we're still discussing why blind people are special. I mean, why are we discussing it? Because, you know, it's crazy.
Mhm.
And thank you for joining us today. And it was really nice to
Oh,
listen.
I loved it. I love talking about this subject. I think it's the most really interesting. And I think it's actually about humanity. It really is talking about how we as humans see ourselves. And I think, you know, I want more people to write about history, blind history, and it is happening. It is happening. So, and I promise.
Selina, please give us an opportunity to read your books.
Yes.
For maybe in both we can scan, no problem. But if you have any book, please send.
Audio. I'm guessing next year they're making an audio book of it. So
audio is not necessary for it can be in print, it can be electronic. No problem. If there is something, please send it us, and we are wondering the details.
I will come to Istanbul. I will come with the book.
Yes, great. And now we are at the end of the today's evening event.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
I also really enjoyed it. And
before thanking you, we would like to also thanks to our translator Faruk and Chebnem.
Yes,
they have a very good job. Thank you very much.
And good evening to everyone. And see you tomorrow.
Stay safe. Stay safe.
You too.
Stay safe also. Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye bye.
Evet, yine kaldık biz bize. Bir şey diyeceğim. Elif niye gitti?
Ben buradayım aslında.
Tabii senden bir sürü geldiği için Elif var. Evet.
Çok komik oldu.
Engin abi keşke erişilebilirlik sözünü dinletseydik. Onun da hoşuna giderdi. Ama geç kaldım tabii bunu söylemekte.
6 tane Elif vardı.
Çok komik.
Interpretation'ı kapatıyorum.
Saydım yani 6 tane.
Ne diyeceğim arkadaşlar, YouTube yayını, şimdi bir şey soracağım Çağrı bunu. YouTube yayını sonlandırabilip ikinci bölüm için ayrı bir YouTube yayını yapabiliriz. Farklı olur. Ne diyorsunuz? Çünkü iki farklı oturum ya. Ne diyorsunuz?
Evet, öyle yapalım ve 5 dakika ara verelim mümkünse.
Tamam.
Benim bir önerim var.
Ben 10 dakika
İngilizce
Abi Bey mikrofon.
Bir dakika. Ben yayını durdurayım, öyle öneririm. Arkadaşlar bir saniye.
Ee, 18 geçiyor. 25 diyelim mi?
25 diyelim, tamamdır.
Tamam, ben o zaman şu an çıkıyorum. Görüşmek üzere.
Moderatörlüktü. Emeklerine sağlık canım.
Ben teşekkür ederim ya. Yani
Gayet güzel.
Tekrar görüşmek üzere.
Gayet iyi. Çevirilerin gayet iyiydi. Ben hala...
Çocuklar teşekkür ya Şebnem Faruk. Vallahi.
Ya,
Ne demek? Ne
hiç
demek?
önemli değil.
Bu arada ben çok zorlandım.
Arkadaşlar,
Müthiş bir şey yaptım.
Yeni zorlanma.
Şebnem'le Faruk'u alkışlayalım, öyle durun.
Hayır yapmayın.
Ya evet ya ne